Personally identifiable information, or PII, is any data that could potentially be used to identify a particular person. There are many examples of the types of data that make up your PII. This could be as simple as your full name. Personally identifiable information includes somewhat public information, like your full name, address, birthday, or email address, and online account handles. But PII is also private numbers assigned to you by government agencies, like your social security number, driver's license number, or passport number. It may include numbers assigned to you by your school, such as student identification number, financial aid account numbers. It can also include account numbers, PINs, keys, assigned to you by private entities for things like payroll, health insurance, bank accounts, or credit card numbers. In Wisconsin, a common legal definition of personally identifiable information is your last name and first name, or initial, combined with specific government identification or account numbers, or biometric data, such as fingerprints or DNA, if the element is not publicly available and not encrypted. With a combination of these PII data points, someone can steal your identity, access your money, or create fraudulent accounts that can impact your financial future for years. Use caution when anyone asks you for PII for any reason. Ask yourself if you contacted them and if they really need that particular piece of information. Only provide as much PII as necessary to receive the services you are seeking. Make sure forms are secured or destroyed by the companies you do business with. Secure or destroy papers that have account numbers or PII. Items such as bills or bank statements should be locked away or destroyed when you are finished with them. Credit cards, account information, checkbooks should be secured to limit access so roommates, guests, casual acquaintances cannot access them without your knowledge. Do not supply PII during online transactions on unsecured networks or computers. Communal terminals may save your account information and passcodes when you check email, social media sites, and that can lead to unauthorized access of much of your PII. If you do use a shared device to access personal account information, be cautious and wipe the saved history before logging off. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media.